Hello and welcome everyone, and today I want to talk about the minion meta changes that I would like to see in 3.22 and of course going forward in Path of Exile 2. This video focuses on minion abilities and passives, not ascendancies, because we already know about the former and their limitations, whereas the ascendancies are more of a mystery until we actually get to see all of them, which I hope will happen during ExileCon later this week. A lot of what follows is obviously highly subjective, so please take it with a grain of salt. The first thing I want to talk about is the passive tree. Most of the minion clusters are well-rounded. Grave Intentions, for example, is decent but highly situational. I only recommend using it to mitigate damage from the Ancient Skull, or while doing content where you encounter a lot of chaos damage, like Delve or Cyrus. Some nodes could probably use a slight buff, for example, Sacrifice should probably have 30% minion life instead of 20%. Decay Ward is something I always use in League start scenarios because it's cheap to anoint and increases minion survivability. Later on you want to replace it with something more powerful, like Grave Pact or Charisma, and having to spec into the entire wheel is kind of unappealing because the small passes feel pretty underwhelming. I personally think they should give 8% minion life and 15% attack or spell block, whereas Decay Ward should probably give your minions 20% attack and spell block, as well as 3% life recovery on block. The minion cluster I really wanted to talk about though is Ravenous Horde. While movement speed is certainly an important stat for melee minions, and Onslaught on kill might seem interesting on a first glance, the notable is actually pretty underwhelming. You can get a similar amount of movement speed from Bone Rings, whereas Onslaught on kill is only useful for builds with few minions and doesn't work if you or your AG are using Gravebind. It also doesn't work against bosses, which limits the usefulness of this cluster even further. However, Onslaught on hit seems too strong for a notable passive and would also make the Guardian Ascendancy and the Guardian specialization on the Ascendant obsolete, so this cluster should be replaced by a double wheel similar to the Redemption Righteous Army cluster. Both arms of that new cluster should give minion stats that are otherwise not really accessible right now. One arm would grant minion damage and area of effect, with the notable granting larger values, and the other arm would grant minion damage and projectile speed, with the notable granting minion projectiles the ability to pierce. There are currently two minion-themed Keystones in the game, and both are in need of a rework. Minion Instability lets minions explode when they reach 50% HP, dealing a third of their life as fire damage to surrounding enemies. It can be scaled with minion life and damage, and requires a proper setup in order to trigger. This includes Tavokai for SRS, Earendil's Embrace for skeletons, Phantasmal Quality or Replica Earendil's Embrace for zombies, or Infernal Legion for minions in general. In order to create the minions, you can self-cast them with Spell Echo or Unleash, utilize Cast While Channeling with Cyclone, or trigger them using Null's Inclination. While the latter has terrible stats and can only be used in map-like content, the other methods can be clunky and will cost you support gems, reducing your DPS. The other keystone is Necromantic Aegis, which grants bonuses from your shield to your minions. This means you're losing out on the explicits, implicits, the defensive values, and the block chance, but you're still able to use abilities that require a shield, like Tempest Shield or Shield Charge. Some of the better uses of this keystone include the introduction of minimum power and frenzy charges, or energy shield recovery on block for your minions. This, however, is still not worth losing the defensive capabilities of something like Aegis Aurora, or the offensive power that proper minion shields provide. Since Minion Instability is just a worse version of Deathwish from the Maw of Mischief, and Necromantic Aegis is just horribly outdated in general, I think both of them should be replaced by completely new keystones instead of being somewhat buffed. A major issue with minions is the AI and how we can influence it. The most important modifier in that regard is minions are aggressive, which is currently only available from 4 sources. The Delve modifier on convoking ones, which is expensive and costs you DPS, More of Mischief, which is terrible for minion builds, Feeding Frenzy support, which isn't great for the main minions because it doesn't grant damage directly, and Primordial Might, which only affects golems. The best way of toggling minions aggressive would be to either add it to the Feeding Frenzy buff or to make it an offensive minion mastery, replacing the less than useful Unholy Might on kill. Before I dive deep into minion abilities, I wanted to mention that most minions have a type tag if they have a specific theme going. The exception to that rule are zombies and Holy Relic, which should both get the physical tag added for consistency. Other minor changes I'm advocating for are duration buffs to both Absolution and SRS, because even with increased duration from Enduring Bond and Mistress of Sacrifice, these abilities simply don't last long enough, especially during boss fights with invulnerability phases. The 4 Vaal minion skills, Vaal Domination, Absolution, Animate Weapon, and Summon Skeletons, have varying soul costs and soul gain prevention timers. While this is good in general, the balance is a bit off, which is why I think they should be reworked. Vaal Domination should cost 15 souls and should keep its 20-second soul gain prevention timer. Vaal Absolution should cost 30 souls and have a 20-second soul gain prevention timer as well. Since Vaal Summon Skeletons and Vaal Animate Weapon are much more powerful than the former, they should both cost 50 souls and have a 30-second soul gain prevention timer for consistency. The minion I want to talk about next is probably the all-time favorite of the community, namely the Spectres. In theory, the most versatile minion of them all, in reality most monsters that can be revived don't have a set of coherent abilities, meaning that either the damage or the general type of the abilities doesn't match. Using them as offensive minions also locks you out of a lot of utility, like charges on minions, and to make matters worse, the base damage of most Spectres is so low that it's questionable whether you want to use them as offensive minions to begin with. In fact, the only reason the Frostbearers from Crucible League were performing so well is because of their mortar-like projectiles being able to hit the same target multiple times. To address this general lack of damage, some of the nerfs that Spectres have received over the last couple years have to be reversed, especially how the gem level translates to the level of the Spectres. We also need the ability to save Spectres beyond Desecrate, because I for sure am tired of losing access to some of my Spectres because of gear changes. We also need better access to monster data, maybe some sort of generic bestiary, because currently they can only be accessed via PoE, which is needlessly convoluted. Summon Skeletons is another community favorite that is in need of change. The life of the Skeletons should be equalized with SRS, which would also make Auron's Warpath an interesting endgame option, because you could actually scale skeleton survivability to viable levels. To make up for this change, the cluster notable Blessed Rebirth should be removed from the game, which I expect will be met with some resistance from my fellow summoners. The damage of the warriors is fine, but both the skeleton mages and archers could use a damage buff, in part to make up for the changes to the Vaal skill I advocated for earlier. The skeleton warriors have 3 hidden abilities that most players don't know about: an innate chance to block attack damage, and a 15% block chip, which in combination with the low hit pool significantly reduces warrior survivability. In addition to that, they also have a gap closing ability, which they only use when toggled aggressive. The innate block chance and the chip damage should be removed to equalize the defense of the skeletons across the board, and the warriors should obviously be able to use dash in general. Golems are permanent minions with large hit pools that differ greatly in terms of the abilities they have at their disposal. Except for the Carrion Golem, both the abilities and the AI of most golems are in need of a rework, in case of the latter because they prioritize following you over attacking enemies that aren't in your immediate vicinity even when toggled aggressive. The Stone Golem is a favorite of mine that I played back in Sentinel League, but it sadly has a couple of issues. As you can see, the roll doesn't function like the leap slam of the carrying golems. Instead, it's a vector-based attack that often doesn't reduce the distance to the boss because the golems simply roll through them. To make matters worse, it is also multi-strikeable, which in combination with the low damage reduces the DPS of the golems significantly. The slam deals a decent amount of damage, but the golems only use it when they are at melee range, despite it having a large area of effect. To improve the Stone Golem, the roll should no longer be multi-strikeable and should stop on impact with enemies. The golems should also use the slam when the distance between them and their target is at most 80% of the radius of the AoE, so to not waste any time when attacking. The Ice Golem is remarkably similar to the Stone Golem. Both its default attack and Cyclone deal physical damage. However, unlike the Stone Golem, its third ability is a spell that deals cold damage. While the Cyclone is a great movement skill that also deals decent damage, the Ice Spear is obviously mismatched in terms of ability and damage type, and as such should be changed into something similar to Ice Crash with a small cooldown. In general, I would like to see all of the abilities to be attack-based and deal physical damage, while also giving the Ice Golem an innate 100% fist to cold conversion, similar to SRS. The Lightning Golem is a minion that was made viable in 3.21 due to the changes to returning projectiles, which is why I made a high-end version of it that you can check out in the description of the video. The Lightning Golem uses 3 abilities: a lightning arc that deals abysmal damage, an aura that slightly increases lightning damage with a short duration, and a lightning projectile that deals a medium to lowish amount of damage too. The composition of the abilities is kind of okay, so the fixes should be mostly numerical. The lightning arc needs a huge damage buff, roughly a factor of 10 or so. The aura should be made permanent, and the lightning projectile needs around 15 to 20% more damage than it currently has. The Flame Golem is another spell-based minion that on first glance has a functioning composition of abilities. However, a deeper look quickly reveals that they're all dysfunctional in their own way. Immolation has an 89% less cast speed modifier, terrible range, and damage. Flame Arc has mediocre range, meddling damage, and a 2-second cooldown. And Magma Ball has meddling damage and a 6-second cooldown. The only good thing about the Magma Ball is that it has mortar-like projectiles, meaning multiple projectiles can hit the same target as long as their AoE overlaps. While it is possible to use Pledge of Hands for low budget builds to lower the dependency of the Golem on cooldown recovery, this isn't feasible for higher budgets due to the complete lack of minion modifiers on the staff. To improve the minion, the Flame Golem's Immolation should be replaced with a proper fire spell, Flame Arc should have increased range, Magma Ball should have a lower cooldown, and the abilities should deal more damage in general. The Chaos Golem is the last golem I haven't mentioned yet, and honestly it's kind of a mess. It features the default attack of the physical golems, a dart that deals chaos damage in an area, and a cascade spell that deals physical damage that is 100% converted to chaos damage. Not only are the abilities mismatched, the spells also have terrible base damage, which is why complete rework is needed. The cascade should have 2 to 3 times higher base damage, 5% base crit, 200% effectiveness of added damage, lose its cooldown, and become the Chaos Golem's default ability. The Chaos Dart should also have its base damage increased by 2 to 3 times, and the Golem should receive a new ability similar to Reign of Chaos of the Grotto map boss. The next minion is one of my all-time favorites, namely Animate Weapon. The ability itself is working well, and I already talked about changes to Vaal Animate Weapon earlier. What I actually want to discuss is Spirit Guards, which is a threshold jewel that allows you to animate ranged weapons. This jewel currently only works in the jewel socket next to Supreme Ego, which is too far from the part of the passive tree that we actually want to invest into. The threshold should instead be based on intelligence, so we can put it into more appropriate sockets like this one. However, the real issue with the jewel is that you actually have to animate ranged weapons from the ground, making it completely useless for the majority of the content. It should instead transform animated lingering blades, including those animated by the Vaal skill, into ranged versions of the minion, similar to how that Reckoning functions. The last minion that desperately needs a rework is Holy Relic. It's a unique minion that doesn't attack or cast spells. Instead, it triggers a Holy Nova when the player hits enemies, which has a cooldown that can be lowered to increase damage. The most prolific ways of triggering the Holy Nova include Static Strike and Cyclone, both of which are clunky because they force you into melee combat and lock you out of using Convoking Wands. The other issue of the minion is the limited number of Holy Relics. The base number is 1 to be specific. This can be doubled by using Joffrey's Crest, but that locks you out of using proper minion helmets like Shaper Elder influenced multi-link bone helmets, or helmets that give you plus levels and mana reservation efficiency. If Holy Relic is ever to become meta, it needs to have its damage and number of relics buffed significantly, although I'm afraid this might just be a minion that is meant to be utility and as such will probably never receive those buffs. Everything else is pretty okay, including abilities like Dominating Blow or Animate Guardian's Weapon from Chains of Command, which function really well in map-like content, but don't do well against bosses, which in my opinion is conceptually fine. There are other mechanics I could have mentioned, like the spiders from Arakali's Fang having limited damage. This, however, is not really about the spiders, but instead about the dot cap that currently exists in the game, which I expect will be removed in Path of Exile 2, but as per usual, only time will tell. And that's my 2 cents on the current state of the minion meta and the changes I would like to see. I'm curious to know what you think about these ideas and how the minion meta should evolve in the future. I hope you're as excited as I am for ExileCon and 3.22, and I will see you in the next one.